The neighbors from hell. What do we consider as bad neighbors? I guess it all depends on one's culture and expectation, and it can differ from one country to another. If you were to ask Tomoko, she would tell you that her neighbor living right above her apartment is the epitome of a bad one. The neighbor would always have friends over, drinking and partying until the wee hours of the morning. The noise is unbearable, even for the bustling area of Harajuku. On the other hand, if you were to ask Shihao, it would be his 60-year-old neighbor, who is a hoarder. Over the years, she would come home with bags of random discarded things, consisting of plastic bottles and aluminum cans, just to name a few. It is a nightmare, especially when one lives in a public housing, like the small and congested HDB flat, in hot and humid Singapore. And as for Sarah, it is the group of neighborhood gym goers opposite her house, in the suburb of Brisbane. She never understood the concept of driving just a few blocks away from home, only to attend the gym around the corner. For her, there was nothing more ironic than that. What makes things worse is the fact that some of them have so brazenly parked their cars in front of her driveway. But surely, nothing is worse than having a neighbor across the street with two Rottweilers for Osmi, who suffers from xenophobia, an extreme and irrational fear of dogs. Sometimes, when his neighbor forgets to close their gate, one of the Rottweilers would escape and walk over to his place just to taunt him. Osmi knew that the dog could definitely smell his fear. Despite upgrading his life from a city slum where stray dogs roam around freely to living in a gated community in Kuala Lumpur, he has not managed to escape his fate. Now back to Tomoko. She segregates her rubbish perfectly and would always keep her mailbox empty and clean. Unlike the rest who would let their mailboxes overflow with flyers for weeks on end. Her apartment would always smell clean, with a hint of laundry scent on some days and roses on others. For someone that seems to have a cat or two, she definitely manages to keep the place in order. In addition, maybe she loves organizing her things. Just a few years back, she was seen bringing a huge plastic storage container into her apartment unit. It was not strange, as storage containers can be used to save space, to store clothes when seasons change, or even all of her luxury handbags and shoes. She is the longest staying resident in the apartment, as most tenants would leave after a year or less. For some reason, she likes it that way. She often keeps to herself, but would smile and greet her neighbors if she happens to cross paths with them. In fact, Tomoko is a model resident in the small but cozy apartment in Harajuku. She stays just a few blocks away from where she works as a cashier in a convenience store. Unsurprisingly, she would often bump into some of her neighbors, and recently, the neighbor who had just moved into the apartment unit above hers. On most days, he would buy a lot of snacks and alcohols, in which case, she would know when to prepare for a sleepless night, which happens far too often, more than she could bear. Meanwhile, moving all the way to Singapore, we have Ji Hao, who, in contrast to his neighbor who is a hoarder, is an avid cleaner. Is it just psychology? Does he feel the need to keep his place extra clean, to somewhat regain the sense of control of which he has none to what is going on outside of his flat. And in particular, the one on the other side of his wall. If only his 60-year-old hoarder neighbor would take out the trash as often as he does lately, then maybe the hallway would not be littered with garbage. However, while a hoarder has an inability to get rid of things, for fear that they would need the items in the future, however, could not wait to get rid of his garbage. He knew that the thing he had wanted to get rid of was no longer of use in the future. It used to give him a sense of power and satisfaction to own it, but once he was done with it, all he wants to do is to get rid of it. Nevertheless, it was harder for him to get rid of it than he had initially thought, but that did not stop him, for fear of turning into the hoarder that his neighbor is. There is nothing that Sarah wants less than attention nowadays. Not in the quiet suburb of Brisbane. She had everything under control until the gym was opened 6 months ago, across the street from where her house is. The Mazda CX-9 that belongs to a woman in her late 40s has been parked just at the corner of her driveway unashamedly every other day. She had taken it upon herself to do some investigation, and that was how she had found out that the woman is, in fact, a nearby neighbor who lives just a few blocks away, but is too lazy to walk to the gym. And out of all places, chooses to park at the corner of her driveway. However, things are starting to unravel for Sarah, as the hatred towards her bad neighbor is slowly growing, up to the point where she no longer feels the need to be civilized. She had burst into the gym one evening to give warning to the car owner of the Mazda, who had by then been parking at the corner of her driveway, and sometimes in front of it, every other day, for several months too long. Her anger was pacified, but not for long, as within a month or so, the same car had continued to park near her driveway just as before, not heeding the warning that she had given. This time, she had decided to take a picture of the car and posted it onto a Facebook community page for the neighborhood. She had written a long post describing the unsavory behavior of the neighbor in the hopes of getting some support from the rest of the other neighbors. At first, to her delight, most neighbors agreed and showed their support for her, with some even going as far as to share their own similar experiences. However, unfortunately, it seems that it will not last for long. Finally, yet importantly, Osmi, he seems a bit out of place in the rich gated neighborhood, but no one is judging. His neighbors are more amused of his fear for the two Rottweilers. Some had agreed with him that they were vicious animals, not to be kept as pets. Is a Shih Tzu, or a pug, or even a cat, not cuter and more lovable instead? They would argue. Surely less vicious looking. However, some would also come to the defense of the two boys. They insisted that the neighbors are lucky to have those two there, as guard dogs for them, especially from intruders or suspicious people. It is often said that dogs have the ability to sense if a person is good or bad. Could the two Rottweilers smell something from Osmi? Sure, he is a newcomer. He does not look like he came from money. But perhaps new money. Who knows? People did not want to speculate. Osmi has not caused a single problem at all since he had moved in. How could a malicious person be scared of dogs? Apart from having bad neighbors, all of them have one more thing in common. They are in fact themselves, more than anything else. The neighbors from hell. Tomoko had wanted to launch a formal complaint to the building management regarding the constant loud noise into the wee hours of the morning from her neighbor upstairs, but could not do so. She has been keeping a dark secret from everybody for close to 3 years now. If she were to open her mouth, there is no doubt that instead of her neighbor, she herself would be in the limelight and the target of authorities. For the secret that she had kept would land her in prison. When she had moved in more than 3 years ago, no one knew she had also moved in with her aging and ailing father. He was the only way that she could afford a small room in Harajuku. She had been collecting his pension money for several years now, and when she found him cold on his futon one day, his body had already gone into rigor mortis. She had to make a hard decision to keep it a secret so she can continue receiving the pension that they had been living off. There is no way that she could continue living the way she does, with the minimum wage that she is earning as a cashier in the convenience store. With her taste for expensive shoes and handbags, she was desperate for the extra cash. She knew that since her mother had died many years ago, her father did not have many friends, and on top of that, most of their relatives are estranged. Therefore, it was hard for people to notice his absence. What she was not sure about was whether the corpse would start its decomposition, and that the smell of the decomposition would start seeping out of the apartment crevices, sending alert to the surrounding neighbors. Thanks to the bags of cat litter, buried together with the body of her deceased father, inside a plastic box storage, she was able to suppress the smell. It has been 3 years now and her plan seems to work. Now, the neighbor who has moved into the upper floor apartment unit several months ago threatens to unravel her darkest secrets. Jihao's intention is similar to that of Tomoko, which is to avoid drawing attention to himself and his apartment unit. He could only pray that, if the apartment were to catch fire, he would be somewhere else, and not trapped inside the apartment next to a hoarder, where it is almost impossible to get out, in the case of an emergency. Nobody knew what had happened to the missing escort, who had gone into his apartment unit and never came out. You see, Jihao had found a loophole to avoid being caught on the CCTV in his flat. He had made use of the advantage of living near the stairs on the second floor right next to a hoarder. The only other CCTV, besides the one that was being blocked by his next-door neighbor, is the one inside the elevator. The night that he had brought back the 19-year-old escort with him to his flat, he had insisted that they use the stairs instead of the elevator, as his unit was only on the second floor. The escort had unknowingly obliged, not aware that it would be her last night alive. That night, he had played a sick game with her, and by the end of it, he would slit her throat and dismember her inside his bathroom. He had to make sure that her voice was not heard, so he had gagged her, even before his sick game had even started. In a way, Jihao saw it as a blessing that his neighbor is the way she is, a hoarder. He could always blame her for any smell, or even any noise at all. She was, after all, the one who is obviously unhinged. He is just an ordinary 9-to-5 type of salaried worker, and the only thing that people would feel for him is sympathy, to be stuck living beside his bad neighbor. In a twist of fate for Sarah and her neighborhood in the suburb of Brisbane, some videos had started surfacing on the same Facebook page. The owner of the Mazda had apparently installed a drive recorder that can capture any movement nearby. In retaliation to her public humiliation, the owner of the Mazda had decided to share some compromising videos of multiple girls, as well as several suspicious-looking men coming in and out of Sarah's house. In the videos, it could be seen that the girls were obviously in distress, although it could not be proven if anyone had done anything wrong or if any of them were actually in trouble. In fact, there are 5 young women whose passports Sarah had kept inside a locked safe, only she had the keys too. When Sarah had moved into the neighborhood several years ago, it was a typical Brisbane suburb. Not much went on, and the neighbors had more or less kept to themselves. It was perfect for her human trafficking syndicate. Even if people were curious, she could always introduce the girls as her relatives, who came all the way from China. The girls would not speak either, since their language skills were not proficient enough, and also for the fact that their fate lies in her hands. Now, Sarah is afraid that her human trafficking syndicate would be uncovered. On the other hand, in yet another part of the Asia-Pacific region, in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, where Osmi lives. The true fact is that the only reason Osmi could afford to stay in the exclusive gated community in the first place was due to a deal he had made with the devil himself. 8 months ago, the news made a headline.
Businessman shot dead in broad daylight while having breakfast with wife, murderer believed to be a hitman still at large.
That was Osmi. He had made a few connections, due to the nature of his work, ironically, bad ones. Osmi is a man of few words. An extremely trustworthy one. He will neither speak nor ask questions unless absolutely necessary. The traits that would later caught the attention of one of the most powerful underground criminals. You see, Osmi was a police officer who had gone rogue. He had quit the police force and had turned into a hitman. He had started off his career with good intentions. To make a difference in his community, to be on the law-abiding side. But the monetary temptation was too powerful for him. All he could do every day was to pray for forgiveness from the Almighty, and continue doing what he thinks is his fate in life. What do you think? Do any of your neighbors seem suspicious? For some, like the seemingly law-abiding Tomoko, always quiet, keeping to herself, but would pleasantly greet her neighbors occasionally, it would not cross anyone's mind that she would illegally collect the pension of a dead person, and even beyond anyone's wildest imagination, that she has been keeping a corpse inside the 4 corners of her small apartment. Since she knew the pattern of the tenants around her, she would probably patiently wait for a few more months before a new tenant moved into the apartment above. And, if she were lucky, as she has been all this while, a quiet one, so she can keep living the life she wants, with the dark secret only she knows. And as for Ji Hao and Osmi, they will probably get on fine too. Everything seems to work out in their favor. Because they are a dime a dozen, living in typical Southeast Asian cities. Almost boring, in fact, compared to their neighbors, one who is a hoarder, and the other one with 2 vicious Rottweilers. Sarah, on the other hand, would probably appear in the next breaking news. At least hopefully. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to stay tuned. I will be updating weekly.